And now we're going to move into a slightly different aspect of our topics today. And so we will be welcoming Spencer Meyer, Dr. Spencer Meyer of NCX. He will be speaking today about the Natural Capital Exchange Organization and their carbon marketplace opportunities. Dr. Spencer is the Director of Science, Strategy, and Stakeholder Engagement at NCX. Spencer is responsible for working with stakeholders to link the science and business of natural capital markets. He also leads the company's development of new ecosystem service credits, including biodiversity, habitat, water quality, and wildlife mitigation. Spencer is an innovator and a leader with 20 years of experience working collaboratively with NGOs, government, private sector, and academic partners to solve natural resource challenges. And he is also the co-founder of Seabago Clean Waters, an advisor to conservation NGOs and private foundations, and a frequent speaker on forest management, watershed protection, natural climate solutions, conservation finance, and partnership development. He's previously worked with the Hystad Foundation, Harvard Forest, Yale School of the Environment, University of Maine, the Nature Conservancy, and he has a MS and a PhD from Dartmouth College in Forest Management and Sustainability Science from the University of Maine. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Spencer Meyer.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you here this morning. Pia, Heather, and Ned, thank you so much for the introduction and the welcome, and most importantly, the invitation to come speak with the group today. I'm really excited to do this. First off, I'm based here in Guilford, Connecticut, where I live. NCX does work all around the country and increasingly outside the country, but I'm based here in Connecticut, so not too far away from many of you. And the original reason I think we started talking about this panel idea was because some of the work I had done at the Hystad Foundation, which is based in Connecticut and does work all around New England. So I just want to briefly say kind of how I got to do what I'm doing now based on some natural climate solutions work we had been doing at the Hystad Foundation with a bunch of partners around New England. We had been following the state policy agendas for climate acts. Most of the states, although not all of them in New England, have ongoing policy and stated goals for reducing emissions. And there was a lot of discussion and conversation, but not a ton of action in some cases. And we were really interested in understanding, well, what is the opportunity? How big is the opportunity to do natural climate solutions in New England in particular? And of course, a lot of what is relevant in New England is so right over the border in New York and New Jersey as well. And so we did this study, and it is still forthcoming. It should be out from Hystad in the next month or two. That looks at and comes up with what we think is the first estimate of the forest-based natural climate solutions for the New England states based on additional wildlands, forest conservation, changes in forest management, and urban forests and forestry. And so we're all excited to see that come out, and I think we'll have a lot of policy relevance as well. It was during that work, doing that work, that I first got excited about and interested in the evolution of carbon markets, carbon credits, and how they've evolved a long way since the early days. And I'll say a little bit about that earlier. And it really became apparent to me that there needs to be an incentive in carbon markets to pay landowners to change their current behavior. A lot of the existing programs have really been focused on paying landowners to kind of for what they have already done, and then to more or less keep it that way for a very long time. And there are a lot of important reasons to do that. But for me, and what I saw was really about, we can change behavior in the near term that will have much bigger long-term upside to that from my perspective. And it just so happened NCX, the Natural Capital Exchange, had been pioneering harvest deferral carbon offsets over the last couple of years. And this was built on almost a decade of climate technology, data-driven forest remote sensing and inventory services that they had been providing with large landowners throughout the US. And so I'm going to tell you a bit today about the program that we have at the Natural Capital Exchange, or NCX. And then I'm going to bring it back to the wildlife, because we are called the Natural Capital Exchange, which is inclusive of a lot of, or really all, ecosystem services. And we have started with carbon, but we're quickly moving into other ecosystem services as well. And I'll talk a bit about that as we get going. Okay, so by now, probably everyone's pretty familiar with the IPCC goals for the world and the math that adds up to us needing to reduce our emissions by about half by 2030 and getting to net zero by 2050. And there are lots of different pathways, and there's many, many examples of this graph here. But the bottom line is we need to stop putting stuff into the atmosphere And we also need to negatively remove carbon from the atmosphere. These are the negative emissions that are at the bottom there. So we have to both stop putting as much in, that's lowering our current emissions, and then we need to remove some of those former emissions from the atmosphere. And all of you here know that forest and agriculture in many ways, but forests in particular, are a really great way to do this. They're biologically wired to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. But as we know, the devil's in the details. And what's most important for solving this problem is making sure whatever you are doing is additional to whatever we were doing before, because this graph, the peak there, already assumes we were doing everything we had been doing before, because that's how we got here. So if we only count up how important our forests are today and we say, oh, look, we did a good job, our forests are sequestering a lot of carbon, we are not able to change or bend that curve. And so we really need to focus on changing what we're doing in a positive way to get to carbon removal. So here are the forests of the United States. 43% of these are owned by family forest owners. That adds up to a little over 10 million acres across the US. And the reason the different categories here are important is because the kind of management activities and objectives that all these different classes, whether they're public landowners or large industrial, private, or family forest owners, the kinds of management that they all undertake varies considerably. And so if you want to incentivize landowners to do something differently, you need to understand how they work now and what's in it for them from an economics perspective to make all of that make sense. So here are the forests of the United States. 43%, remember, are family forest owners. The problem with the first round of carbon markets, that was the California Air Resources Board program, which is quite old at this point, was that the economics of doing those projects and the inventory and upfront costs were really a barrier to entry. And so in effect, you couldn't really do carbon projects on fewer than about 5,000 acres. And that varied a little bit by region, but on average, 5,000 acres was kind of a benchmark for that. And that left out most of the family forest owners in the country. So by our math, 61% of the acres in the US are under that size, under that 5,000 acres. And so immediately you have left out a lot of people. So one of the first principles of NCX was to democratize the access to the carbon markets, if you will, through the voluntary carbon markets. And that was really important to be able to get smaller landowners to be able to participate in the market. The second key ingredient in NCX, so the first is allow smaller landowners because we want to get to scale to make a big difference. The second is to make sure the quality of the carbon credits that we're producing with our partners meet certain criteria that we'll talk about. There has been quite a bit of bad press at this point over the years about legacy forest carbon projects where they have and have not made a difference, what the specific shortcomings were, and how the field sort of needs to evolve to make sure we're all creating high quality carbon credits that really are making a difference. It's, at the end of the day, if the atmosphere doesn't feel the change, they don't really matter. And so organizations from private landowners to academics to NGOs to sort of international watchdog groups have really been shedding a lot of light on the importance of quality in the carbon credit markets. So what we are doing at NCX is really sitting in the middle as an auction or a marketplace between individual landowners who are getting paid in our program currently to not cut their trees for 1 year. That's what we call the harvest deferral method, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And we are bundling the carbon we can generate from that across a large portfolio of hundreds and thousands of landowners. And we are turning those into carbon credits, which we are then selling primarily to corporate sustainability programs who have their own net zero commitments. Now, it's important to remember that it's early days in the net zero commitment world, in that a lot of the need and the supply for credits will come in future years. It's not happening immediately, because it's really important for these companies to be focusing on reducing their actual emissions. Carbon offsets can never be at the expense of reducing emissions, direct emissions. They need to be additive to that. And so they are part of a portfolio, and they should be a relatively small part of the overall portfolio. So that whole industry and understanding of the ratio of those two things is really evolving as we speak. And so the demand, for carbon credits from offset programs is expected to grow rapidly in the next decade. So the quality I mentioned about carbon offsets really comes down to these three, and there are other factors, but particularly these three: additionality, permanence, and leakage. Additionality is what I said earlier. The thing you do that you get paid for has to be on top of what you were doing already. Otherwise, the atmosphere is not going to see any difference. The permanence is, does the activity have an effect on the ground, and is that effect lasting? Now, often 100 years is set out as sort of like the default idea of what permanence means, but of course, permanent is way longer than that. Now, I said a minute ago, we are doing these one-year harvest deferrals, and I'll get into in a little while why that benefit is permanent. It has to do with the act of delaying a potential emission and the time value of the damages we expect in the future associated with climate change. And then leakage is, well, if I pay this landowner to do something on the left, but the neighbor across the street just harvests more to satisfy that same market, well, that's leakage. And you haven't really affected anything. And so carbon credit systems need to address all of these in various degrees. So NCX's core technology was built when the company was called Sylvia Terra. Our founders, Zach Parasa and Max Nova, are in this image here, showing the first map that they built, what we call base map, that models it and estimates the amount of carbon and the individual trees and species on every acre in contiguous United States. So that adds up to 92 billion trees in this base map data set. And this is at a 30-meter resolution. It's a combination of remote sensing data and forest inventory analysis data, and then more localized ecological data that all come together and create this uniform surface across the US. And this was developed through a big partnership with Microsoft's AI for Earth program. All right, so that's the base map. Now, how the program actually works is that we do an initial property assessment using base map. As landowners come to our platform, they can put their property on the platform by clicking basically and drawing a polygon on our map of where their forest is. And then our data science team uses our base map to produce an enrollment report for that property. And it estimates how much carbon is there now. And then we have what we call our baseline model that estimates how much carbon would be at risk if that landowner chose to harvest their property, or more likely a small portion of their property in any given year. That baseline model is based on local harvest demographics, mill prices, distance to mills. So really it's getting at, does that landowner even have an opportunity to harvest their property? And for landowners that have no opportunity to harvest their property for whatever reason, because they're too far from the mill, or they just harvested last year and there's no timber left, or any one of the many reasons, then they're not going to be eligible for our program. You have to have standing carbon on the ground, and you have to have a reasonably high risk that you would, which we quantify, that you would actually harvest that property. So based on those two things, NCX will come back to the landowner with an enrollment report, eligibility report, and say, here's how much carbon you have on your ground that you could forego. The landowner then gets to make a bid in what's called a reverse auction and say to NCX, here's how much I am willing to receive, how much I will take from you in order to not harvest this year. And so this is the reverse auction, step number 4 here. And then NCX and the landowner together can come to terms if the auction clears, and then the project will officially begin. Now, we are monitoring and measuring the property through our base map and through subsequent inventories, supplemented with on-the-ground inventory as well. This is not only done remotely. There is a subsampling that's done on the ground by foresters in boots, the old-fashioned way. And so we monitor this project at the beginning of the year, and then again at the end of the year. And then we look at the difference between what was there at the start, what was there at the end, and what would have been there had the landowner harvested that using our harvest estimate and our baseline business as usual modeling. And so then if the landowner followed through on what they said they would do, or in this case, what they would not do, then we pay the landowner for that carbon that they kept on the ground for an additional year. Then the landowner is eligible to re-enroll the following year if they want or not. It's up to them. All right, so we create a new project every quarter of every year. So each quarter we invite landowners to enroll their property in our program in the cycle that I just described. We just closed our winter 2022 cycle. We had 1,800 landowners across 39 states choose to enroll. And you can see that map roughly corresponds to where most of the private forest land was in the United States. Those 1,800 landowners own collectively 1.6 million acres that we were able to do in one quarter. So just in the course of a few months, that's the number of landowners that chose to forego harvest over the subsequent year. Now that those landowners are enrolled, we are monitoring their properties, and we will check in with them at the end of the year and complete the transaction for those that have followed through. The estimate of the climate benefit associated with that is 250,000 tons of CO2e expected at the end of that year. All right, so now our carbon credits, we are going through the process of getting certified through VERA, the Verified Carbon Standard, one of the leading carbon offset programs. And we have developed a new methodology based on this annual delay of harvest, and that's going to the VERA certification right as we speak, actually. So we hope to have that done by the end of the year. Now, as I said, I want to get back to the wildlife and some of the other ecosystem services. We have started as a company with carbon because that's where the market has been, and we saw an opportunity to innovate there. And now that we have that underway, we're beginning to turn our attention to some of these others. We have a lot of interest as a mission-driven company to focus on biodiversity and wildlife habitat in many of the ways that we just heard from the other speakers, because of the management problems associated with some wildlife species and the interaction with carbon. But for other species, there is value to society of having them more broadly from a biodiversity standpoint. So it's not only about their impact on regeneration, although that is a very interesting one to us because it dovetails the carbon and the wildlife habitat as well. We also have a lot of interest from our partners in looking at what kind of landowner activities from wildfire risk reduction could generate additional carbon. In the short term, you are likely to reduce your carbon by, say, thinning a forest. But in the long term, if you are reducing your risk of wildfire, there is a long-term upside to the atmosphere from a carbon mitigation, avoided emissions perspective. So we have several initiatives going on in these other ecosystem services as well. Currently, what we have on our impact dashboard is an example of a few different wildlife species, including deer, by the way, that we have mapped in the places where we're doing carbon offset projects and looking at the prevalence and population dynamics of the wildlife in those areas. We are not yet in these species linking them to the carbon outcomes specifically, but we are beginning to do that and just hired a new wildlife ecologist to join us this spring to do that work. The coastal marten is the newest species we added to our dashboard just recently. And you can also see some examples of how much the carbon offset projects we've done, what the distribution is by tree diameter and by forest type across the US. So overall, so far in the last 4 cycles now that we've done projects on 4.3 million acres with almost 2,500 landowners with a total expected CO2e benefit of 1.13 million tons of CO2e. So that's what we're doing, and I would love to take some questions and would invite the conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Spencer. That was great, and you got a lot of questions, so I'll just start working through those. First question comes from Kevin Webb, who works with us at Knudsen, and he asks, does NCX take into account access issues and topography of the property when determining likelihood of harvest?
Yes. So the base map and the harvest risk assessment together use a lot of different factors that predict the harvestability. The ease of access is one of those factors, and this is part of the sort of improving model. So as we do more properties and the data get better, things like that improve over time. So we are incorporating that to some degree. Very fine grain like issues that an individual landowner would have, we wouldn't have access to information around that. However, we do talk to the individual landowners when we do the projects. And so sometimes we have landowners come to us and say, this is really interesting. Thank you. I don't actually have any plans to harvest. And so we say, well, then you're not eligible for that. Even if our model predicted that they were going to harvest, when we get that new kind of information, we say, thank you, come back another time. So some of the information we do across the whole country, and some of the information is specific on what we receive from the landowners.
Great, thank you. Next question comes from Mike Knudsen, who works on our conservation easement team, our land conservation team at Knudsen. Just for background, does NCX work with private landowners that have properties which are encumbered with conservation easements, which may place restrictions on forest management activities?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really important question. And I just thought of another example about the previous question from Kevin. So one example where the local topography, or in this case, the distance to streams matters, is if there are best management practices about riparian zones, for example, and there are in most places, sometimes they're legally binding, sometimes they're just best management practices, we reduce the harvest probability risk in those areas in the same way that you would if you had a management plan. You would be able to harvest less from those areas. So there's a sort of tangible example of where that matters. I'm sorry, I lost the new question though. I was so excited.
No, that's okay. Does NCX work with private landowners who have properties that are encumbered with conservation easements?
Yes, absolutely. But we need to know the details of that conservation easement, because some easements, forever wild easements, for example, tend to already preclude, well, in the case of forever, they do by default, preclude harvest. And so if you are already bound legally to not harvest, you have zero risk of harvesting. And so there's no additionality there. We couldn't possibly do any better than what you're already doing. And so we would not enroll that landowner. That happens to the sort of due diligence process with the individual landowners, where when we discover that there's the easement, we then need to look into the details of it. Importantly, in the very early days of forest carbon offsets, in the first California projects, for example, that was not yet a problem. And there were people enrolling projects and getting paid for carbon. In this case, it wasn't harvest deferral, it was avoided conversions, or improved forest management avoided conversions. That was already in forever wild easements. That got changed after the first few years. I forget exactly, but ours absolutely does take that into account. That said, there still are plenty of easements that are working forest easements that we work with routinely, including land trusts and other landowners that manage their forest.
Thank you. Next question is from Shawn Hardy. They ask, how would a sawmill slash probably timber harvesters work with NCX to ensure that they don't encourage leakage or otherwise undermine the carbon sequestration goal?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned leakage. So there are two kinds of leakage. There is leakage across a whole market, and then there's activity leakage at the finer scale. And the way we mitigate leakage at the fine scale is by ensuring that landowner enrolls their entire property. So a landowner that has 1,000 acres can't enroll the 500 acres they weren't going to harvest anyway this year and not enroll the 100 acres they were going to harvest. They don't get to cherry pick. That is central to our program. So a landowner has to enroll their entire property in that. That has not always been true across carbon programs. It's increasingly becoming true, and it is of ours. Now, there's also broader market leakage across the whole system. And so if we work with landowners, let's say in Mississippi, to not harvest, the overall market, the commodity market for pulp, let's say, is probably going to get that wood from somewhere. So the way we handle that, and the way any certified carbon offsets handle that, is through standard market leakage deductions that are set by the verifying body. So Vera, for example, has a standard deduction associated to cover market leakage.
Great, thank you. Okay, this question is coming from Seth McKee. He asks, perhaps I missed this, but what is the source of funding being used for this compensation framework? Are these private sector offsets?
They are private sector. So we sell carbon credits to corporations who are trying to meet their net zero goals, and we use that money to pay landowners to change their behavior.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Jim Lyons. Jim asks, I understand the carbon benefit of avoided deforestation, but could the same concept be applied to avoided development? For example, forest clearance versus conversion to development. Is there a way to capture that carbon benefit for avoided forest conversion in your business model? Obviously, there is a wildlife benefit to be captured as well.
Sure. Yeah. So what I didn't spend much time on is that there's lots of different so-called methodologies or protocols of carbon offsets across all industries, but in particular forests in this case. So there are avoided conversion protocols. There are improved forest management protocols. Ours is the one we are working on now, our first one, and we have others under development, but our first one is a harvest deferral. That is delaying the harvest in a managed forest, because we know we have a strong ability to measure and track the additionality associated with that. One of the concerns that the industry has had broadly about some of the other types of voided conversion is that there's not a strong way to say what would have happened had you not paid the landowner for that. And there have been many examples where land that was already protected from development in various ways was paid to not convert. And so there's been a lot of questions about, are you paying for landowners to do things they were doing anyway? And that's the question about additionality. So with any one of these methodologies, or whether it's avoided conversion or changes to forest management, you have to have a strong, robust way to understand what that additionality would be. So that's something that is important to us. We won't develop a new methodology if we can't figure that part out first.
Great. We have one more question here. How is the ownership of properties determined to avoid fraud? Is the title pulled on each property? It's coming from Kevin Webb again.
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I can tell you we have a whole landowner team that does pretty significant due diligence. I've seen a lot of examples that, for example, on the easements, right? We need to see the easements, actually see evidence of those easements. I don't know the degree to which titles are pulled. I can't answer you there. I'd have to get back to you on that.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, we have about 8 minutes left for discussion, but I wanted to just open up the opportunity for folks to ask questions to any of the presenters or bring up anything else. I still have questions coming in for Spencer here. So I'll just keep working through those, but I do want to give people an opportunity to ask other questions as well. So if you would like to ask a question to another presenter, please feel free to use the raise hand function, which is a little hard for me to see, or just put it into the chat and just let me know who you're targeting, or if it's just a general question and someone can take it. Right. So Spencer, there was a question that came in right before I said that. So from Helen Marsh, given the impact of deer populations on forest health, how are you considering this issue?
Yeah, deer is a really interesting one, and that's why it was so fun to follow the presentations earlier. And that is why I asked Tom the question about how much does it cost to do that? So on our impact dashboard, we have white-tailed deer as one of the species that we have mapped. And depending upon who we show that to, sometimes they come back with a like Bambi, warm and fuzzy, we love critters, that's awesome perspective. And sometimes they come back with a, oh no, deer are ruining our forest perspective. And as we heard, it all depends upon where you are and what the herd is like and how bad the impacts are in your forest. So you can imagine if you are starting to try to understand how changes in management behavior, in this case, everything Tom described, there's a carbon benefit associated with that, right? Tom showed us those graphs that showed that small seedlings, large seedlings, and then saplings over time are starting to go the direction, all us ecologists want them to go. And so that's great. And there's a carbon benefit associated that would not have happened had it not been for that management. So, and we are starting to do this kind of thing. We have not done it in the way that I'm going to describe conceptually, but you could imagine, you could understand what is the economic inputs it takes to get a landowner to do those things, just like Tom described. You could go, and I think Tom has gone the next step and said, what is the carbon benefit associated with that increased recruitment into the sapling and eventually mature tree class? And you could calculate the cost it would take to generate a certain amount of carbon after, let's say, 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. So that's the kind of market making we want to be able to do in between. And so that's why we're starting to move in some other species. Now, in that case, it's one that has a direct link between the carbon and the wildlife. We have other species that society values for lots of other reasons that maybe aren't about carbon. And so we want to be able to do that also. But moving into species where there's a carbon link is a strong next step.
Just to give everyone a heads up, we've been working with Rutgers University studying carbon impacts to our land management over the last 4 years. And so we will have some of the data soon, I would say, over the next couple of years to understand the differences between the impacts that deer management is having on forest sequestration of carbon.
Great, thank you both.